My guest is Gerald Steinberg. He's a professor at Barrowland University, and he's also the founder and president, is it, of NGO Monitor? Tell us about NGO Monitor first.
This is a research organization that I started when I realized that the non-governmental organizations, primarily that deal with or claim to deal with human rights, humanitarian assistance, involved in a lot of the politics of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, that they've never really been examined critically by academics. I looked for that material, I found very little, I started to do it. It became a sort of a snowball effect that there were more and more requests and more areas to develop. And then I began to get people who, assistants or colleagues to join me, students, and I decided for all sorts of reasons that it was not the most appropriate thing to do within a university. There's some advocacy involved. It gets very dirty at various times, and so it became an NGO on its own. And has really...
How many people are involved? I mean, I get your, in the emails almost once a week, twice a week. I don't know how often they come, but
average of once a week. We try not to do more than that.
Yeah,
there are a lot of issues.
But you don't do just one issue. NGO Monitor often covers a number of issues.
That's right. There are just so many of these out there. The activities and different levels of it internationally, in the UN, domestically, Canadian issues that come up and big fights. New Israel Fund. We've got a staff of about 10 people now. 5 or 6 of them are researchers. Most of them, I would say, are students, post-students, and graduate students, people on that level, and a couple of people that do media and organizational aspects, fundraising. So it's a small NGO, but it's certainly grown a lot, and we find it's an infinite amount of work to be done there.
And you make an impact, but some of the people have reacted and said, oh, they're just a new McCarthyite kind of place. Have you heard that kind of remark?
Yes.
Oh, you have heard it.
Get that all the time.
Okay.
There's a
What's your defense?
It's not a defense so much. Let's talk about the substance. If you have a disagreement, let's have that. The purpose of doing this is to have the debate that's really never happened about these organizations and the political power that they wield. They need to defend themselves. They need to be able to address the issue substantively. If a lot of the reports turn out to be not factual, is the best way I can put it, to be based on eyewitnesses that can't be checked, that often contradict each other. The Goldstone report is full of examples of that. Let's have that debate. To attack me or NGO Monitor using slogans, and a lot of the people who use the term McCarthy, I'd have no idea what McCarthy was or did, or the environment, is basically to say, we don't like you guys to talk about us. We're used to not being criticized. That's an absurd approach.
What do you think well, first let's talk about what you think they do wrong. I mean, clearly they have a good record on a number of human rights things, Falun Gong, or where a state is persecuting people and they document. They do a good job, don't you think?
I think there's a lot of inconsistency, and they become big business or big political powers, and I think the quality of the work, from what we've been able to see, and looking at it quite in detail over a number of different years and areas, they become, instead of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch began as advocates for prisoners of conscience, both in the Cold War period, both behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, China, but also in fascist countries in South America and Greece, people who disappeared. That was not primarily a research framework. That was about advocacy, and it was pretty consistent in what they did. When the Cold War ended, they morphed. It's very much like the morphing of other organizations that lose their original purpose for being their objectives. They morphed and called themselves and became recognized as the arbiters of international law, of proportionality, of military necessity, of all sorts of military details. And frankly, neither Amnesty nor Human Rights nor most of the other organizations that claim to report 50-page, 100-page reports. I think Human Rights Watch did hundreds of pages on the Lebanon War, extending over a year and a half, saying things which they have no professional expertise in. So that's a major issue, and then the question becomes why, and what are the biases, the political biases. This was based in Israel. It came out of the Durban Conference, the NGO Forum of 2001, and this intense obsession with focusing on Israel and trying to create the label of Israel as an apartheid state, massive violation of human rights. Why is this obsession with Israel? It's double standards.
Why is it? I mean, people use the phrase low-hanging fruit and that kind of thing. Why is it Israel? Is it just that? Or because look, there are Jews very active in both organizations, and are they post-Zionist, anti-Zionist Jews? What's the mix there that's motivating?
I'm going to start with a little bit of an academic cop-out and saying the question is going to be better than any of the answers I can provide, and the answers that I'm going to suggest are ones that need to be checked in more detail. I don't claim to have the answers. But it is a very important question, and I answer it with a combination of factors that combine together to create this obsessive double standard approach on Israel, different than everybody else. I think there's a political ideology behind this that is not necessarily Israel focused, but is anti-Western, anti-American, often called post-colonial. Chomsky, Edward Said, democratic Western capitalist societies are responsible for the suffering of people of color of the Third World. Palestinians, Muslims are the primary symbol of that. Israel is the tip of the arrow of the Western imperialist enterprise, the occupation. You put all that together. That's a large part of it.
Because I'll give you another hypothesis. Not that it's post-colonial or that it's Edward Said influence, but that in fact in criticizing, they've set themselves off of making human rights their secular religion that overrides everything, interprets just war theory, which is a different kind of measure of things, all within one monistic world that's really very pluralistic and very competitive. And that's different than being postmodernist, because postmodernist says there's no standards, whereas they're insisting on absolute standards. So I suggest it's a very different explanation.
I accept it. As I said, there are a number of different factors, but if your explanation is correct, why so much focus on Israel and so little on Sri Lanka when the issues are very similar? And that gets to the issue of low-hanging fruit, of the alliance, tacit or explicit, depending on how you look at it, with the Organization of the Islamic Conference through the United Nations mechanisms. If you want to speak in the UN, particularly in Geneva, you want to be seen and photographed and reported and have all the benefits, you've got to toe the line. And the line is Israel, Section 7 of the UN Human Rights Council agenda, which is always to talk about Israel. There's nothing similar on any other country. So the NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and that whole enterprise industry has lined up with that agenda. It's also, there are, I guess, ideological, personal issues. When the article by Ben Birnbaum and the work that we've done, you see that the people who work these issues are often people who come into this, not from the perspective of universal human rights, but from the perspective of being activists or people involved in advocacy, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli, however you want to define it. This connection between the admiration that Sarah Lee Winston, the head of the Middle East division of the Human Rights Watch, has for Norman Finkelstein is something that is very strange in a framework of human rights advocacy.
Well, there's a kind of combination of human rights advocacy, but Israel also represents, after all, it's a tribal society. It says we believe in a nation and Jews have the right of self-determination. And disproportionate number are Jews who identify with a cosmopolitan cause. And so there's that antipathy between that which makes their identification as cosmopolitans a question. I think, it once used to insult Jews by calling them cosmopolitans. Now it's the credit of how you're really a true internationalist because you're not tied to any particularity.
Which is, in many ways, a personal agenda. Yeah. If you have, and I'm guessing this is the case with Ken Roth, because having read and had exchanges with him, someone who is post-national, we have a lot of posts in this business, but there's a post-nationalist ideology. And here we have these Jews coming back and embracing this nationalism, this European nationalism, which has proved to be so destructive. That's another layer that I think that adds to it. So I don't want anything to do with this, he says, and the people that he brings in, and other people like that too. It's an alienation from Israel as a Jewish state as well. So I think all these factors contribute. You're talking about a relatively small number of people, and when you add up all the factors, those are the ones who tend to be the most visible, vocal, and powerful in this process.
Yeah, they have a lot of money behind them, as you've said, I know.
And that's another aspect
I find it very tragic because human rights are so central and so important, but they're not, the new religion. And to make it the adjudicator of just war or getting into, I thought the Goldstone report, as I know you do think, was terrible. Anyway, I want to thank you, Gerald, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Israel in the Jewish world values diversity and equality, explores cultural strengths and struggles, and promotes understanding and acceptance. We hope we've succeeded. We welcome comments, criticisms, ideas. Please drop us a line. We also welcome new members. Join us. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'm Howard Adelman. Good night until then.